right? Seller wants to sell, buyer wants to buy, right? But there's always that negotiations aspect of it that stops the deal. And this is where most of the deals fall out of escrow, because the buyer and the seller cannot meet in the minds. You know, they don't meet eye to eye. They don't see each other in the same level, where the buyer is willing to bend or the seller is willing to bend. This is why your job and your responsibility is to know how to navigate the process and ultimately make it a win-win for all, right? A win-win for the seller and a win-win for the buyer. So negotiating the deal is one of those components that you know, we all have to understand. So what is the repair request and then the seller's response? Well, the RR, as you can see, the request for repairs is the form. Hey, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we're requesting these items to be, you know, taken care of before close of escrow. The RRRR is the seller's response to the buyer's reply of request. This is saying, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I understand you sent us the request form, but this is going to be our response. Either we're going to take care of it or we're not, or we're going to negotiate something different. All right, so these are to facilitate as part of the negotiations. And what I want you to understand is, you know, in the process, once you're in escrow, right, which is a good feeling, right, when your offer gets accepted, and now you have, you know, 17 days to do your buyer's due diligence, right? Do a thorough inspection of the property, get second quotes, right? A home inspection, a chimney inspection, electrical inspection, a sewer foundation, you know, any and all inspections, including termite inspections as well, right? So the buyer can do as many inspections as they choose to satisfy themselves to the overall condition of the home. That's their job, that's their responsibility, right? Because they need to be completely satisfied, because part of the condition and part of the process is that the buyer will have to release that as a condition. And if the buyer doesn't release that as a condition, what happens is the seller can send out the notice for the buyer to release that. And if the buyer doesn't within, you know, 48 hours, then ultimately the seller has the option to cancel. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, is because sometimes sellers believe that because the buyer and the seller did not come in any meeting of the mind, that if the buyer requests to cancel, that the seller has the right to go after the buyer's deposit. Well, it only happens if the buyer has released any and all contingencies. And I want to repeat, when the buyer releases any and all contingencies, just because he releases one doesn't necessarily mean that the seller can go after the entire commission, or excuse me, the deposit, right? It's only when the buyer has released everything: loan, physical inspections, disclosures, HOA, any and all. It has to be checked off on the contingency removal form. Now that satisfies the position that, one, the buyer has done all their inspections, all their reviews of all the disclosures and documentations, and the buyer has also released the loan as part of the condition, right? And also the appraisal as well. That's part of the process. Now what happens is when the buyer releases any and all, it now exposes the buyer's deposit. So we have to be very, very careful in how we approach, you know, this, because once the buyer releases any and all contingencies, then you're in a bad predicament if the buyer chooses to cancel or the buyer cannot perform, right? Buyer does not get the loan necessary to buy the property. So these are, you know, sensitive conditions that the buyer has to understand, and it's your job to explain that on the do's and don'ts and the pros and cons on this. Okay, so first, when you send out a request, you're sending the request. If you represent the buyer, it's the RR. If you are representing the seller, you want to acknowledge. Now, also with that, please keep in mind, if you do represent the seller, right, and the seller doesn't have to agree to any of the terms that the buyer is requesting. What's so ironic and what's so interesting is that the purchase agreement already says in black and white that all property are sold in as is condition, meaning that the seller doesn't have to even acknowledge the request of repairs. which is funny and interesting, but that's what the contract says, that the seller does not have to acknowledge, meaning they don't even have to respond to your request. Now, in good faith, right? And we always talk about the practical approach, right? The spirit of the contracts is what I state, is that in good faith, you should at least consider to either do, don't do, or negotiate, because it keeps the dialogue and it keeps the momentum that at least we're making an effort to close out the deal, right? Because again, as I said earlier, the end goal is for the seller to sell, the buyer to buy, right? So I hope this kind of puts some thought into the conversation. So how does the RR form work when it's a buyer's request? Well, here's an illustration, guys. Buyer request a repair, use the form RR. List the repairs too long, then zip form will automatically attach a text overflow addendum. So don't worry, the RR, and I'll show you a copy of the RR. Basically what it is, it's, let me show it to you right now. So if you have more that you want to add, right, then ultimately, don't worry, it'll include an extension form, right? So this is the request of repairs, right? This is what you're sending the seller, right? You're going to send out the date of preparation, the date that you're preparing this form, and then you're going to put all the crucial information, right? The address, the buyer's information, seller's information. Now there's some components here, right? So one, buyer's request. B, what sections. C, buyer's requesting credit. D, buyer requests seller to modify the purchase agreement. So there's, fix it, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. Give me credit, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, or, do a price reduction, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. Now, section B, 1 and 2 talk about the termite. Subsection 1 and subsection 2 of the termite. If the buyer is requesting termite to be done as part of the request, then the buyer is going to check off that and then put out the date that the inspection was done, and then who was the company that provided that report, right? If the buyer is requesting section 2, then they're going to check both section 1 and section 2. And again, illustration, you're going to put the same date and obviously the termite company that was initiating the inspection. If the buyer is requesting a credit in lieu of repairs, instead of saying, hey, I know we want the AC done, we want the toilets replaced, whatever the case may be, right? In lieu of any of that, Mr. and Mrs. Seller will just give us a $5,000 credit, right? Then this is where you're going to put that request, buyer request the seller to credit $5,000 at close of escrow. Typically with that $5,000 usually goes as credit to the buyer's closing costs, closing cost. So if you read, note, any credit including this paragraph is separate from all, shall not reduce or supersede any other credit in the limit pursuant to this agreement. Total credit amount may not be enough to remedy all defects and repairs. Okay, so what it says that, please be advised, this is a disclaimer and a disclosure, that even if we're asking for $5,000, may still not be enough credit and incentives for the buyer. And also, if it's more than enough, then the lender may also say, we cannot use all of the $5,000 towards buyer's closing costs. So then how do you separate that? Well, you can say, look, part of it will go to closing costs, part of it can go to reduce the interest rate, right? By what we call buy down the rate. So there's ways of how you can navigate those. Now, also with the request of repairs that I want you to understand is you can ask for one or you can ask for all three, meaning you can ask for a repair, you can ask for a credit, and you can still ask for a price reduction. So you can ask for all three. Meaning, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we want you to repair the AC. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I also want another $5,000 for credit. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, on top of the AC being repaired, 5,000 credit, we're also asking for a price reduction from 800 to now 795. Okay. You can ask all three requests, or you can ask for one or two, okay? That's part of the negotiations, right? Now, also keep in mind is you want to keep the deal alive, right? You want to keep the deal alive and not be where you kill the deal. This is where most agents, unfortunately, fall short, drop the ball because they're so involved in the trenches of asking for any and all. And sometimes it's the buyer, right? But this is where your job is to kind of navigate that, right? Navigate that conversation and tell them, pride of ownership, this is not a brand new construction home. There's going to be some wear and tear. There's going to be some issues with it. Be practical in your approach because, again, the end goal is to take care of your buyer's best interest, but it's also best practice to protect the seller's best interest, right? So it's a two-way thing. Any questions regarding these paragraphs here, right? You can attach the reports, if it's a home inspection, if it's a termite inspection, if it's a sewer inspection, you can include all these reports as part of it. If you're asking for a price reduction, as I said earlier, you can put in the price reduction. Let's say that it's $800,000, but now you're asking for a $5,000 price reduction, then you can put it as $795. Now, section 3 talks about FHA, buyer FHA, and VA lenders requirements, right? Actions in the appraisal. So if the appraisal comes back with certain conditions, then we're going to put those conditions as part of the FHA or the VA. Seller or buyer shall pay for any such repairs. And this is where the negotiations, because let's just say that the seller does not have the means to take care of these FHA or VA conditions. Well, you can say, look, I want this property and whatever it takes, I want to get this property. I don't want to kill it because the seller cannot afford to do those repairs, right? The buyer can ultimately take care of those repairs as part of the process to satisfy the lender's requirements. So here it'll say buyer. If you uncheck it, then it'll say seller and whatever those conditions. And usually, as I said earlier, the conditions come from the appraisal. Okay, then you need to take care of that. Otherwise, if those conditions are not met, the appraisal will go back. And if they're still not met, then unfortunately, the buyer is not going to be approved for the loan. Okay. Section B talks about buyer's request to seller pay for following costs or expense required by FHA or VA loans, right? If seller agrees to all buyer's requests, buyer accepts seller's partial acknowledgement, then ultimately here, the buyer will sign. And then here, seller's response, right? So seller shall agree to all buyer's requests. Seller will only partial agree to certain things except. So whatever the seller is not willing to do, then they can put, we're willing to do X, Y, and Z, but not B as an example. Okay. Any other conditions, right? Seller agrees only applies if the buyer removes any contingencies, right? So if there's any others, then remember there's a CR form that must be attached to this as part of the requirement, basically saying, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we're willing to do anything you're requesting on the request of repairs, but under these conditions that you also release that as part of the agreement. I am not going to go forward if you're not willing to release those conditions or the contingency in place, right? Now, this is a new form that came in, I believe this year, June 22nd. So they added this expiration date, which is the best thing because for the longest time, Section D was not part of that request. Section D talked about expiration of seller's partial condition agreement. So I love this because now it gives the seller a time period, right? In paragraph 1B, 1C, and if check, seller agrees to the repair request may be withdrawn by seller at any time prior to buyer's agreement in writing and shall be deemed revoked unless by 5 p.m. on the third day after it is signed by the seller or by, you can put a certain time frame, and it is reassigned by the buyer below, and a copy of this request is delivered to the seller, right? Now, the seller can also disregard all this, right? Uncheck all this and say, look, we're just going to send a new response, which is the RRR form, right? So seller responds to buyer's request. on the following RRR form, right? Number 3 talks about buyer's requests are not incorporated into the agreement. Seller responds to buyer's request on the attached addendum to existing form, which is the the AEA form, right? No seller signature is required on this RR form. Seller does not agree to any of the buyer's requests. If the seller does not agree, right, the stipulation here is the property, the offer that the buyer submitted is 3 days by 5 p.m., right? If you look at this section here, let's just say that the buyer submits it today, right? Today is Tuesday. So today would be considered 0 days. So tomorrow will be 1 of 3 days. So then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday by 5 p.m., that's when this form is void or revoked, meaning it's withdrawn, it doesn't exist anymore. So this is where, again, communication is crucial. Okay, are you on the buyer? Are you on the seller to make sure that there's conversations? Because if you wait and there's no conversation, then whatever request the buyer is asking may be canceled out. Then we have, so we talked about the seller does not agree to the request, basically saying whatever the buyer's requested is seller is not going to agree to it. So then the final part of it, it says buyers respond to seller's partial conditional agreement. Do not sign until after seller responds above. So basically what it says is after the seller has responded to you, then the buyer has to make a decision. Buyer accepts seller's partial condition agreement, or buyer does not accept seller's partial agreement. Buyer withdraws request number 1, right? So whatever you put on request number 1, if it was a fix this, credit this, price reduction this, then you're voiding that and starting new with a new condition, right? And maybe it's still certain things from the first repair request, but now you want to take one thing. You still want to put whatever your buyers want as part of the agreement to reintroduce it on request number 2, because this one does not incorporate to the next request of repairs. I hope that kind of makes sense, right? Meaning that if you're going to ask for a second time certain things, but you're removing certain things from the original, then you must add whatever you're carrying over from the first, because the first completely is eliminated. It's like it never existed. Okay, so you want to make sure that whatever you're going to incorporate to your to your second request of repairs, that you carry it over as part of the agreement, right? And then it says buyer's responsible, right? Buyer's responds to seller's partial agreement on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of the copy by making the buyer response. Any previous buyer response, seller reply, or seller partial agreement can no longer be accepted. So it's right there. Then it talks about the FHABA. If the parties do not reach an agreement on completing the repairs and other actions, paragraph 3A in the FHABA section of the buyer's request, and you have already removed or do remove your financial contingency, even though you may no longer be eligible for an FHABA loan, may not be able to get another loan to purchase the property, you could be in breach of the agreement, and if otherwise unable to pay seller the purchase price, okay, then the buyer would sign. Okay, so let me continue back with the PowerPoint. All right, so buyer's request of repairs, right? So termite repairs, list of repairs are too long, then automatically will be attached. Termite repairs can be requested based upon an already conducted inspection. All used to request credit, price reduction in lieu of repairs. Credit must be disclosed to the lender. Total credit may not exceed lender's allowable credit. So typically, if you're asking for $30,000 worth of credit, right? And the closing cost is only $15,000. unfortunately, the rest of that money cannot be used towards closing costs, then you need to figure out where that rest of that $15,000 needs to go. Either do a buy down, or that money goes back to the seller. Give the seller copies of the report request. So part of the initial process, folks, what you have to understand is if you are asking for certain repairs, you want to back up that request with an inspection report, a summary, an invoice, right? A cost to repair this as part of the negotiations. Don't just throw a number and hope it sticks, right? Back it up with the right documentation, right? If you're asking for a credit or repair, here's the documents that put us in that position that we are asking for the repair. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, here is the report that we've done by a licensed professional, and the buyer's requesting for X, Y, and Z, right? And then you submit the request of repairs, but you're also submitting the inspection report. If it's a sewer inspection, electric invoice, roof inspection, termite inspection, you're going to incorporate everything with the request of repairs. If seller agrees and buyer signs the RR form, the identified contingencies are automatically removed with the buyer's signature. So yes and no. This is, again, something that I still want to emphasize, that just because the buyer and the seller agree to it doesn't automatically release that as part of the condition. The only way to release that, you still would need to submit a contingency removal form. Okay, and I'll show you what that contingency form looks like, and I'm also going to show you what the request, the seller's request, seller's response, the seller's response to the buyer's request. Okay, so how does the RR form work, right, for the seller's response? So the seller can respond with the RR if the seller agrees everything or nothing in the request, respond with the RRRR if seller agrees to some or makes any changes to the request, not respond to the request, but respond in courtesy, meaning, again, we know that there's a 3-day period. By 5 p.m. this gets canceled. Then the seller can just be silent and says, I'm not going to respond to what the buyer, either the buyer releases this as part of the condition, or they decide to respond. So either or is perfectly fine, but just keep in mind, if there's radio silence from the seller, then it puts a bad taste in the buyer. It's like, how come they're not responding? We're asking for a courtesy response to say, yes, they'll do it. No, they won't. Or, hey, I won't do this, but I'll do that. And that's just, again, common courtesy, right? And it's your job as a buyer's agent and your job as a listing agent to be in cahoots and communication, because that'll keep the transaction alive, right? Because no one wants to cancel. I know as a buyer's agent, you don't want to cancel. As a listing agent, you probably don't want to cancel, because this is a commission in the making, right? You close the deal, you get paid a substantial commission. This is why it's your job and your fiduciary responsibility to stay in the game, the long game here, and help navigate this. Seller agreement is conditional. Buyer must agree to remove identified contingency. Yeah, as I said earlier, that part of the process is, in order for this to continue, the buyer needs to release that as part of the contingency, right? I consider contingencies like walls, right? Let's say that the money is right here, the buyer's deposit, and these are contingencies, these walls. Every time a buyer releases a contingency, now the seller is getting closer and closer and closer to the buyer's deposit. Once you release any and all contingency, now you're exposing the buyer's deposit. If the buyer decides to cancel, the seller may have some rights to any and all of the deposit, right? Depending on the condition and the terms, right? So you got to be very, very, very careful in how you navigate those, because again, if there is uncertainty of the loan being approved, then you do not want to release the loan contingency, because once you release the last part of the contingency and the deal falls apart, then they're going to go after you. It's like, we relied on you, but you gave us wrong advice. We should have never released that as part of the contingency, right? The loan. So make sure that you're in communications with the lender and making sure that they are golden, right? They're 100% approved. You got something in writing that they're approved, and that the conditions are very minimal, that you can get this done within the time frame. Okay, any questions so far? All right, thank you. All right, so how does the request, how does the sellers respond work? So on 1A, the list those repair seller will not make. Seller agreement is conditional. Buyer must agree to remove identified contingencies. Buyer may accept seller's respond or counter terms in 1B, or make a new request of repair. So as clear, as concise as I can possibly make this, right? The ultimate goal is to continue the process, right? That everyone's on the same page, right? And the condition is obviously that if the buyer is requesting certain conditions, repair, credit, or price reduction, that the seller is in consideration, right? Now let's go back about a year ago, 2 years ago, when the market was super hot, meaning that the buyers' interest rates were at 2.5%, 2.75%, 3%, right? And that ultimately scaled property value, right? Where now it was a seller's market, not necessarily a buyer's market, right? So the sellers had control. And the reason they had control is because they were getting 20, 30, 40, 50 offers on the table, which was ridiculous, but that was the market then. It was a fun time to be a listing agent because you were just getting these offers in. So it made it very, very easy for listing agents to cherry pick, right? Obviously, you're going to pick the best 3 of the offers to present to the sellers, right? You're going to present all offers, but the seller is going to pick 3 at least to start the negotiations, right? And then that starts the momentum of negotiations. But once that is done, now is the time for requests, right, of repairs once you're in escrow. This is no difference than in the beginning when you're submitting an offer and now you're back and forth with counter offers. Well, this is the same similarities, but now you're just back and forth negotiating repair request, credit, or price reduction. Okay, so there's negotiations in the beginning, there's negotiations in the middle, and sometimes there's also negotiations at the very end, where you have to kind of navigate this at the very end and not allow it to close or record, right? Because there's certain things that still need to be taken care of, or something else comes up. We may have to extend escrow, or we may have to do something different in order to protect all parties. So just keep that in mind. Buyers may accept seller's respond on counter term 1B. Buyer's signature removal identifies contingency. No signature is needed on the contingency removal CR form, but does so cause no harm and can be helpful. A buyer counters the seller needs to complete section 3 of the RRRR. Otherwise, this section is left blank. Okay. Is seller obligated to make any repairs? The answer is no, with 2 exceptions. One, the purchase agreement, paragraph 11, property is sold as is on the date of acceptance. That's already embedded, as I said earlier. That information already says and stipulates on the purchase agreement. So once the buyer initials and signs the purchase agreement, what they're signing is all those conditions, all those paragraphs that they have acknowledged, understood, and accepted those terms. So part of those terms, it says that the property is being sold in its as-is condition, meaning that there is going to be some faulties to the property. That's why the buyer has the right to do any and all inspections. You can do 100 different inspections within the time frame, okay? Within the time frame. And then once the buyer has been satisfied, then the buyer within the time frame can submit a request. And then that request gives the buyer and the seller 3 days for the seller to respond. And if the seller does not respond, then ultimately what happens, it expires. Okay. And if it expires, then you can do one other thing, is submit a request number 2. Maybe you're going to modify from, asking 20,000, maybe you want to only ask for 10,000 and submit it. You can do it as many times within the contingency period. Because once you release physical inspections, now you cannot, technically speaking, send a request of repairs because you already have lifted that as part of the condition. I hope that makes sense. Exception number 2, repairs required by state and local law. Example, point of sale, bracing of water heaters, retrofitting, sliding and shower doors installed, operating operable smoke detectors, law unable cost of repairs to be negotiated, but partials may not contract to avoid them. So again, illustration. Even if they are points of sale, right? These are state laws. What it says is that the seller is still not obligated to do. If the property is about to fall, collapse, as long as the seller tells you, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, be aware that the property may collapse. We're just cautioning you. Property's being sold in as is, but you shouldn't go in that property because again, it may collapse. As long as the seller tells you that, they're protected. Because if the buyer comes back and wants to sue you, the seller is going to say, well, we disclosed that the property was in bad condition. We said that, we warned the buyer not to go into the property. And if that was put in writing, then unfortunately, it saves the seller from any potential liability. Okay. I know it sucks, but it is what it is. The seller obligated to make repairs. No requirements. Under paragraph 11, state property improvements may not be built to code and compliance. Yeah, absolutely. Let's just take a property from 1950s, right? And then let's take a property from 2022, right? 2 different properties, 2 different eras, right? This is 1950s, is 60 years old. A property that was built this year is new, right? It's not going to have the same improvements, right? The same electrical than back in the 50s. Back then and now, you cannot hold the seller at fault from a property that was built in that era, right? At that time, it was under those conditions and it did pass. But you cannot say, well, today's electrical is not like 1950s. You're going to have to redo the entire electrical. Well, the seller's going to say, well, go pound some sand, right? We've never had any problems in 30 years. The electrical has been working fine. Just because it's not up to code, because it's not a new home, doesn't necessarily mean that I have to do that as part of the condition. Because electrical, to replace the electrical box can be in the thousands, right? $8,000 to $10,000, depending on the size of the home, right? So I want to make sure that all of you are on the same page, that whatever the home in that era doesn't stipulate that it has to be up to par with the current laws and permits that the city or even the state require. No conditions must be disclosed by seller, but they are not required to do any repairs. Now, regarding consideration of a VA and FHA loans, okay, 1, 2, and 3. Repair of a conditional by seller may be required by buyer's lender. Use of FHA VA notice and addendum FVA to make requests for repairs for those loans. And then 3, buyers should determine seller's response before moving the contingency. So keep in mind, and this is, again, we're going to flip the hat a little bit. And let's say that you represent the seller, right? And an offer comes in that's an FHA or VA loan, right? Well, you got to keep in mind that if it's an FHA loan and VA loan, there's certain conditions, right, that are very strenuous in the process that will not allow the buyer to qualify if these conditions are not done. They will not loan on the house. So you want to make sure that you understand your position. If your seller is accepting of the FHA or VA, that there is some special considerations and conditions that must be done. And it doesn't matter who pays for it. If the seller is going to accept an FHA VA loan, then they have to understand that the appraisal may come back with certain conditions, right? This is why a lot of listing agents avoid FHAs And what we saw a lot in the last couple of years is they were avoiding a lot of FHAs and VAs because there was a lot of conventional loans and also cash deals. Now, FHA loans and VA loans are awesome. They're great for first-time home buyers because it allows them home ownership, right, with the minimum down payment. VA, God bless our military veterans, right, the ability to be able to buy a house with no money down and no closing costs. But there's conditions that in order for these two governmental loans to happen, they must have those conditions met. And if they don't, someone has to take care of them or they will not allow the loan to go through. This is why you have to understand those elements when you do accept an offer that's an FHA or VA loan. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And also with the FHA offer, they have to send you the VA FHA addendum, right, which clearly illustrates that, you know, part of the condition is that if the appraisal comes back with conditions, those conditions have to be repaired, replaced. It cannot be credit. Sometimes they'll say it has to be completed before we can close the deal, and the appraisal will go back to verify that. So keep that in mind if you're getting a VA FHA offer. Now let's evaluate the request of repairs, right? Material defects disclosed in the inspection report must be disclosed to others and you know, prospective buyers. Absolutely. So any material facts regarding the property has to be disclosed because that's the number one liability in lawsuits that we see is non-disclosure. If the seller, if the listing agent know of a material fact that may jeopardize the desirability of the home, then it must be disclosed. If it's not disclosed, then the buyer has right to sue the seller and sometimes the listing agent because they knew of this condition. They knew that there was a water leak and they failed to disclose it. And you know that it's been, you know, leaking for years and years and years. As long as you disclose it, then it protects you under the rules and regulations of the state, right? If you don't disclose it, that's where we see issues come in. Other buyers may want similar repairs. Seller's price may be affected if the sale is canceled and the property is relisted. If buyer isn't satisfied with repairs, sellers may face post-close negotiations or liability. This is a common reason for sellers to offer credit or price concessions instead of making the repairs, right? Again, as long as you disclose it and the buyer's okay with it, then we're good. Because the buyer cannot come back and say, well, you failed to tell me that this was an issue. Then the seller can be held liable, and now that's when someone is going to have to pay. So it's better to be transparent. It's better to just advise and disclose. I'd rather have the right buyer that sees the value in the property than the buyer that doesn't see the value now wants to sue you, okay, or sue the seller. So depending on who you represent, you got to look at it from two perspectives, right? Did the listing agent and the seller negligently not disclose that, right? And it's hard to prove sometimes, right? Because if it's a small leak and it's an elderly homeowner that, you know, cannot even go up to the attic, right? And you buy the property, now you go up there and you realize, oh my gosh, you know, this is mold or whatever the case may be, right? You gotta look at the pros and cons to that, and you gotta understand your position, because then the liability comes into play. So you gotta know the ins and outs and understand your position, that if you know, that you need to disclose it. If you don't know, you don't know, right? But if you do know, then you need to disclose it and let the buyer know. Otherwise, you can put yourself in a liability as well, okay? So just keep that in mind. Alternatives to making repairs. So the form request of repairs enables the buyer to ask for repairs, a credit, or a price reduction, or all, right? As I said earlier, buyer can do request for this to be repaired. Buyer can ask for credit, and then the buyer can also ask for a price reduction. Seller may offer a credit or a reduction in price in lieu of making any repairs. Note, repairs of these certain conditions by the seller may be required by the buyer's lender, right? So again, if the house is ready to collapse, right, FHA VA loans will probably not lend on this because of the condition of the home. But cash deals and obviously conventionals with a substantial down payment, the the lender may not see that as a risk. And more so, what is the buyer planning to do, right? They're probably planning to redo, tear down, and rebuild or new construction. So there's many variables in how you can approach this. If the lender disallows the credit, the lender decision must be respected. The credit will not be paid. And solution, ask the lender about the maximum credit in advance. Yeah, if you represent the buyer, folks, it is your job, your responsibility to be asking the lenders questions. What is the maximum amount that the buyer can get as credit? Because I'm going to try to negotiate that. If you already know that top number, then you know how much to utilize for credit, how much for a price reduction, how much to ask for any repairs, right? This is where you got to be in alignment with the lender, so that way you're both on the same page navigating this transaction for your client. All right, so additional resources, the request of repairs, legal Q&A, certain tips. But now let me go back to, the seller's response. So this is what the form looks like. This is now when the buyer submits a request of repairs, the seller is going to use the seller's response and buyer's reply request of repairs, number one, right? If this is the first time sending. If it's the second one, if it's the third one, if it's the fourth one, right? Usually by the first and second, usually we come to terms in an agreement, okay? But here, in accordance with the terms and conditions of the request of repairs, this is the buyer. Is it the buyer's first, the buyer's second, the buyer's third, the buyer's fourth, right? So this is the first. You're going to put in the date, property address, buyer, seller's information, and buyer and seller are referred to the parties, all right? So they are referred to parties. So seller's response. So this is the response that the buyer submitted, and this is now the seller's response back to the buyer. That 1A says to all buyers' requests on number one, and but the only thing they're not going to do is replace the carpet, right? So maybe that's something that they put as a request, but the seller says, nope, I'm not going to replace the carpet. I'll do everything else but except the carpet, okay? Or Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, at close of escrow, instead of your 10,000, I'm only willing to do 5,000, okay? And to modify the purchase, revise, if the buyer came back and says, look, we want a $5,000 price reduction from 800 to 795, maybe the seller says, nope, I'm not going to do 795, but I'll do 797 500. Okay, as an example, right? So they came in at 795, but the buyer came in at 795, but the seller comes back and says, look, I won't do 795, but I'll do 797 500. Okay, or any others. Okay, meaning, on top of all this, I will take care of the termite, as well as section 1, right? So again, it can be all or it can be one, right? Note, any credit included in a separate form and shall not reduce or supersede any other credit in the agreement unless otherwise agreed. Credit needs to be disclosed to buyer lender. Total contractual credits must be limited pursuant to the agreement. The total credit and price reduction amount may not be enough to remedy all defects and repairs. So again, it's a disclaimer and it's a disclosure. It talks about FHA. It also says seller's condition. Seller agreement only applies if buyer one removes the investigation contingency, except the following, right? So if it's except the following here, you're going to put what are the exceptions that you are including including or excluding from it, right? Buyer removes the contingency. Make sure that if you are going to ask for the buyer to come to an agreement, right? You also want to make sure that you're checking off the contingency removal. Okay, buyer removes this condition on the signed contingency removal CR form attached to the buyer's request of repairs, or buyer removes those contingencies identified on the contingency removal CR form, right? And I'll show you a copy of how that looks. Obviously, this condition has an expiration. Sellers proposes the seller's response to buyer's request shall be deemed revoked unless by 5 p.m. on the third day after it is signed by the seller, or if you want to put instead of 5, you can put 6, right? PM, and then you can say I'm gonna only give an additional day for them to come back with a response. So instead of on the third day, right, let's just say we go 4 days, right? So it gives the buyer an extra day to think if they're willing to accept the terms of the seller's response, right? Once that is done, then page 2 talks about the buyer's response. Here, the buyer accepts seller's response and agrees to seller's condition. Buyer accepts seller's response with the following modifications, right? If you agree to these terms, then you're going to leave this blank. You're just going to sign, and that tells the seller that you agree to the buyer's. The buyer agrees to the seller's terms. Then you're not going to check here. You're not going to check here, right? Because checking these 2 items is obviously you're modifying something. You're requesting, right? The buyer's requesting something else included or excluding from it. So you'll leave these 2 blanks, and then you'll have your buyer sign here, and that says that the buyer agrees to the seller's terms. But if there is something that they want to modify, then obviously buyer accepts the seller's response, meaning anything there except, we want instead of 797, right, 500, I want to ask for at least a 796 offer, right? So this is where you can also put that information on here. Oops. Sorry. 795. Okay. No, excuse me. There we go. 796, right? Listing price was 800. Buyer requested a 795. Seller came back at 797, 500. Now the buyer came back and says, "Look, I'll do 796, and we have a deal." Okay, and then that's how you do it. Buyer withdraws request from repairs. Number 1, right? So if the buyer signs off on this check-ins, he has to put a new request. So basically, it voids this and also the request of repairs. Then you need to include now and make a new request, which will be number 2 or number 3. Okay. The buyer, as I stated, if the buyer agrees to these terms, then they'll sign. If the buyer doesn't, then obviously you don't want to sign. Then once that is done, then the seller agrees to the buyer's modification on the terms. Here, seller rejects. Seller does not agree to the buyer's modification. Buyer may submit a new request for repairs. Okay, and either or is perfectly fine. You just want to make sure that you sign off on something. Okay, and if there's no agreement, then obviously there's no agreement. Okay. Any questions? All right, so the next one is the CR form, which is the contingency removal. All right, so this is the contingency removal and how it looks. So if the seller is asking for the buyer to release certain conditions or all, right, this is what the form looks like. Buyer removes of buyer contingencies. So buyer removes only the following individual contingencies, right? Loan, appraisal, entire investigation contingencies, only the part of the investigation related to the inspection, all buyer's investigation other than the physical attributes entire buyer's investigation and contingency except, review of all seller documents, review of all seller documents except government reports, statutory and other disclosures, preliminary title report, common interest, HOA, disclosures, review of lease, liens and items, sale of buyer's property, or all buyer contingency except, then you would check off here and then say we're still holding on to the loan contingency. So when you put a check, is what you're telling the seller is we're still holding on to these as part of the condition. Maybe the appraisal hasn't yet came in. We don't know the value, so you want to hold on to the appraisal, but you're okay with the physical inspections, right? You did a thorough inspection. Your buyer did a thorough inspection of the property and they're happy with the overall condition, right? Then you will save these two. Now, this is the one you got to be very careful, folks. Okay, number 4. Okay, so be careful because I've seen where listing agents will throw and slide this contingency removal with this checked off. Number 4. So always remember contingency removal, subsection 4, right? Buyer hereby removes any and all buyer's contingencies. So what you're telling the seller is all of these are eliminated. Basically, you have agreed to release any and all. So I caution you, if representing a buyer, if you're not completely satisfied and you're still holding on to contingencies, make sure you do not check off this box. Because once you sign off on this on this box, now you're exposing the buyer's deposit. Okay. If the buyer does not go through with the property, the seller may say, okay, that's no problem. I completely understand. You know, the buyer did release any and all contingency and the seller is damaged. So unfortunately, the buyer is going to lose up to 3% of the deposit, you know, and obviously you can negotiate that as well. But the black and white is that 3% can be given to the seller. Okay, so be very careful because section 5 says the following. Once all contingencies are removed, whether or not buyer has satisfied themselves regarding all contingencies or received any information relating to these contingencies, buyer may not be entitled to a return of buyer's deposit if buyer does not close escrow. This could happen even if, for example, buyer does not approve of some aspects of the property or lender does not approve the buyer's loan. Okay, so it's already giving you a disclaimer. And this is where you need to have those conversations with the buyer. Please understand that by releasing any and all contingencies, you know, you're definitely exposing the deposit. So are you okay with this so we can all move forward? Because if you're not okay with it, then I need to know so we can ask for an extension of time, or they're going to send us a notice to perform and we have, you know, that 48-hour window to perform. Otherwise, the seller has the right to cancel. Now you'll retain the deposit, but unfortunately, you're not going to be able to buy your dream home. And this was the home that you desire, right? It hit all the bells and whistles. Just keep that in mind, okay? Once that's done, the buyer is going to sign off on it. The seller does not sign on the contingency of removal. This is only signed if the seller has to find a replacement. This is the condition now for the seller. Let's say you submit an offer. Part of the condition is that the seller needs to identify another property. They have that condition. If they don't find or identify or close on a property, then unfortunately you're dragged into this escrow, but there's no guarantee that it's going to close because the seller never found a property. Then the seller has the right to cancel on you, unfortunately. So this is why you need to press upon the seller. Hey, you know, they have a time period as well, which is 17 days. So from time of acceptance, 17 days, the seller has to release this as a condition. And if the seller cannot identify, then the buyer has the right to cancel as well and send that notice to perform. Okay. Any questions regarding the contingency removal? Okay. Everyone understands how to deliver these forms?
Yeah, I mean, it's just been a lot of information, but you were really thorough with it. So I didn't have any questions because it was like it was clear to me. And it just seems that, like with anything, I always notice the consistent thing with all these trainings is that you can't step over anything. You have to pay attention to every little detail, and you have to be in very good communication through the whole way. So that's like the message through every training, you know?
Right, absolutely, 100%. And yeah, the importance of understanding every aspect, right? The buyer's request, the seller's response, the contingency removal, certain requests and repairs, right? Which is price reduction, credit, or even doing the repairs. So this is where you need to take the handle, right? And make sure that you understand every phase of the process. Because again, if you don't do right for your clients, guess who are they going to be complaining, right? They're going to be complaining about your services. So again, it's knowing how to navigate these conversations and, sitting down with your clients and saying, here are the pros, here are the cons, and, here's what we need to do. At the end of the day, it's about you, because I've heard where the sellers or the buyers will ask you, well, what's your take on this, Simon? What would you do? Remember, they're throwing it at you to say, hey, should I release this as a condition? Remember, don't fall trap to that, okay? You are not buying the property. So how you reflect that back to the buyer is, look, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I appreciate, and I've been doing this for a long time, but I'm not the one buying this property. I'm not the one committed to make the mortgage payment. So I would do unservice and injustice to you to give you an answer. You got to tell me what you want to do. Do you love the place? Yes. Does it hit all the bells and whistles? Yes. Are you okay that the seller is only willing to do X, Y, and Z, but not do A, B, C? I think I'm okay. Okay, then, you have the right to, continue with this process and close and be closer and closer to your dream home or home ownership, right? So let's do the right thing. Otherwise, then the pros and cons is, well, if we don't come to an agreement, then unfortunately the seller is going to send us the notice to perform. And then that's a ticking time bomb. So do you want more time to think? I can ask for an extension of that to be released, meaning when you ask for an ETA form, the extension of time, and I apologize for going a little over my time, but in essence, if you're going to ask for an extension of time, remember, it's all about communications, right? If I'm on communications with Gina, as an example, I want to build that rapport with Gina and make sure that we're on the same page, because her job is to protect her sellers, right? My job is to protect the buyers. But the end goal is for us to continue moving forward, because I know I don't want to start over again, go through the motions, find showings, appointments, and all the submissions, and no guarantee that our offer is going to be accepted. I'm already in escrow with Gina. I'd rather stay with Gina. And it's vice versa with Gina too. Her way of thinking is too, look, I don't want to start over again, cancel, put the property back on the market. Now it's more days on market with no reinsurance and no guarantee that the price that we got is going to be the same price another buyer made. And we don't know what the inspection is going to look, what the buyer's got. So there's a lot of things that can happen if the deal if the deal doesn't close, right? So the ultimate goal here is to work together and finish strong with both clients. Okay. So that in a nutshell, I hope it puts some clarity and some understanding on the practical approach in negotiating the repairs. Okay, remember, all property are sold in its as-is condition, meaning that the seller does not have to give any credit, no price reduction, or repairs. But it's a give and take, right? It's always a give and take, because if the seller says no, then that may say, well, maybe this is not the right property. Let's go find another property, and that definitely can happen. So what's to say that the next buyer is not going to ask for those conditions as well? So it's always best to, stay in the game, negotiate, and bend a little bit to make it a win, especially if the seller, is going to make a substantial amount of money. Now, if it's tied because there's not enough money involved, then yeah, I can see the resistance on the seller from, allowing some type of credit or concessions, right? But at the end of the day, it's finishing strong, closing the deal, and everyone wins. Okay. With that being said, I appreciate you all jumping on this call. I'm surprised we didn't have more people on this. I guess everyone knows how to navigate negotiations, right? But I'm here for all of you. If you have any additional questions that I can answer or address, please, please, please do not hesitate. Please reach out to me. All right. Appreciate you all. Take care. Have a phenomenal day. For South Bay, tomorrow we have our team meeting here at the office at 12 o'clock. So please make sure to be here. Take care. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Julia.